We now have a date and a time for the Virginia Supreme Court to hear oral arguments regarding this referendum that went through on Tuesday. It's 9 o'clock Monday morning. Virginia Supreme Court to hear oral arguments on the referendum passed Tuesday. This is the court that expressed grave concerns. And remember, the court is very particular with their words. They don't say they have grave concerns if they don't have grave concerns.
Hey everyone, Terry here. I just got done with my interview with former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli. He lays out what the legal argument against the gerrymandering referendum is, so be sure to stay to that. I wanted to start off with the previous clip that tells you exactly when the Supreme Court of Virginia is going to be hearing these arguments against the gerrymandering and this new colossally bad map. And then I'm going to end up, after the Cuccinelli interview, a little bit from Nick Freitas. Who doesn't love Nick? He lays it out in just a few minutes what Democrats are doing, how they are destroying the state, and how what they're doing is illegal. So kind of a mishmash today, but particularly Ken Cuccinelli, he has some very good information and he's got some good news for all of us. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Stay tuned through the end for Nick because he's great too. We've got some real warriors here in the state, and that's a wonderful thing to know because I think we've all been feeling a little bit alone, and we're not. Now, before you do anything else, subscribe, like, but more than anything, leave me a comment. I'm really interested in knowing how you all are doing in your part of the state. It's crazy here in Northern Virginia. Where are you at? What's happening? And what do you think is going to happen with the Supreme Court of Virginia? All right, stay tuned. We got Ken Cuccinelli up next, followed by Nick Freitas. Hey, everybody. I am really happy to welcome today Ken Cuccinelli. He was Attorney General of Virginia back in the day, but a great expert. He's really kept his eye on the legal wranglings around the gerrymandering referendum, which, of course, just passed this week in Virginia. So welcome, Attorney General Cuccinelli. Thrilled to have you. As I was just mentioning, you were my state senator back in the day, so we are both longtime Virginians.
Yes, and a little bit sad this week, but there's hope.
There is. And I actually thought, I know that there was a big ruling out of Tazewell County yesterday, but I actually thought a better place might be to start what happened before the referendum. There were legal challenges to this referendum going back months, weeks, and the Supreme Court of Virginia sort of punted on it. And I know Tazewell's kind of been a main figure in all of this. So it might be helpful to know what happened before we even went to the polls earlier this week.
Yeah, so the simple reason is punted sounds like ducked. And under Virginia law, over 100 years of precedent, the vote in the referendum is part of the legislative process. And the courts will not take up a challenge to a legislative act until after the legislative process is complete. And the easy analogy is the people voting yes or no are the equivalent of a governor signing or vetoing a piece of legislation that comes to her desk. And if she vetoes it, it's over, right? There's nothing to consider. Had we voted no, there would be nothing for the court to do. But the yes vote is equivalent to signing a bill. And so now the courts will engage and test the constitutionality and the adherence to constitutional requirements of this referendum. And the other side was just awfully brazen in how they egregiously violated our state constitution in numerous ways. So I think that it is likely that by mid-May or so, the Supreme Court may throw this out.
So you're saying that we shouldn't read into too much about them, not considering anything before? I think it was in March.
You shouldn't read anything into it at all. Frankly, if anything, it goes the other way. They were abiding by their precedent, but they also said, and they made a statement along the lines of, we have very grave concerns about these issues. That is, I can't tell the non-lawyers here just how rare that kind of a brushback pitch is from a court. I think they were suggesting to the people pushing this forward, hey, don't get your hopes up too much.
Really? I think a lot of us misread them not taking action by allowing it to get on the calendar and go ahead. I definitely read it as they're not taking this seriously.
110-year-old Prosser case, and that, first decided a referendum, meaning whether to even take up an issue going to a referendum or not. And we've stuck with that law for more than 100 years.
Okay, so is it easier to start with Tazewell from yesterday, or is it easier just to kind of go through what the arguments against the constitutionality of this referendum, which of course passed, but
it's probably
barely.
easier and more helpful to people to look at what's in the Supreme Court. So there are 3
Okay.
court cases at the moment. One in the Supreme Court that did start in Tazewell, but this is the one they put on hold. And then yesterday's Tazewell ruling added a 3rd constitutional problem. Really, he decided an obvious one. And then the 4th constitutional problem is related to the maps themselves because they're so extremely gerrymandered. The most gerrymandered maps of our lifetimes in Virginia. And we have a constitutional provision that requires compactness and contiguity. And if this map doesn't violate that, then no map ever will.
Yeah,
But
and I will definitely share it for our viewers and I have shared it before. It's insane. I'm in Loudoun and nothing's really happened to me in Loudoun, but the rest of the state is just woo.
yeah, it all kind of starts in Fairfax and then it
Yeah,
fingers
yeah.
out. Yeah. But the court won't get to the map unless it upholds the referendum. And the referendum has very serious constitutional challenges to deal with. So the 2 in the Supreme Court both relate to the first passage of the amendment through the General Assembly. And like most states, to amend Virginia's Constitution, the General Assembly has to pass the amendment twice in the exact same form, once on either side of an intervening election. And therein lies their biggest problem. So they passed this proposed amendment for the first time on Halloween, appropriately, last year, 2025. And
Right.
in Virginia, of course, we have odd year elections. Abigail Spanberger was elected last year, and so was the whole House of Delegates. So they were literally, one other factoid. The last time the Democrats had full control, House, Senate, and governorship, they gave us these so unpleasant 45-day elections.
Right.
So we don't really just have an election day. Election day isn't even the end. It's just the last day you can vote. They are still receiving ballots now as you and I speak.
Right. Yeah.
So it even runs beyond the election day. It's so silly. There's no reason ever for this amount of early voting, and it really messes up security oversight, and it works these election officials to death.
For sure.
But that's another issue, except that it's not. So the 2025 election began September 19th. So people had been voting for 6 weeks when they passed this first passage of the amendment. And they want to count the 2025 election as the constitutionally required intervening election. And their
Right. And at
argument,
that time, like hundreds of thousands of ballots, because I remember it coming out of absolutely
over a
nowhere in
million.
October,
It was
and then
over a million.
hundreds. Oh, yeah. I mean, so that seems not right to me.
Not just to you. You're not alone.
Yes. Well, that's that. And you know what? I think that's a great thing to point out because a lot of people are feeling pretty alone right now.
Well, and I understand that. We all want to win, right? And we
Yeah.
see the horror of Democrat control. We're seeing it in Virginia as we get Californicated so quickly.
Mhm.
So 1 million votes had been cast.
Right.
The election had been going on 6 weeks. And their argument appears to basically be, well, the election is just when you count the votes. That's the election. That argument has been tried all over the country in federal cases, obviously not governed by the state constitution, but they've all been rejected. And this is really just kind of a plain English issue. There's
Okay.
no special magic wand from law school you need to be able to figure out what an intervening election is. The other problem with the Halloween passage was that they were doing it during what they considered to be a still ongoing special session dating all the way back to May of 2024.
Right. Okay.
And that special session was called to deal with the budget. And unlike Congress at the federal level, when state legislatures, typically part-time legislatures like Virginia's, um, come into session out of schedule. So for us, that's the standard session is the beginning of each year.
Yeah.
When they come into session outside of that in a special session, they can only address the subject matters for which the session was called. And the only subject of substance there was the budget. They
Okay.
dealt with the budget, they passed a budget. There's one argument to be made that the purpose of the special session was accomplished, and even without them uh, adjourning sine die, the session was ended by accomplishment of the sole purpose. So
Interesting. So
that's
there's
one.
multi-level argument against what they've done here. It's not just,
Oh
oh,
yeah,
they crammed it through.
oh yeah. No, they are the legal underdogs here. This is they have a serious uphill climb to make to hold on to this bare 3-point win that they got Tuesday.
And I've
And
heard some people, I'm sorry, some people are making the argument that the language used on the ballot could also be problematic. Is that something that's in play, or is that
that was one of the things ruled upon by the judge in Tazewell, Judge Hurley, yesterday,
okay?
along with the third constitutional challenge. Those are the Attorney General Jones, Virginia's current Attorney General, said he's going to appeal that. No surprise.
Right.
But I think the Supreme Court will basically just deal with what's in front of it on the high speed docket that it has put it on. And that appeal out of yesterday's ruling will just play catch up. And we'll never hear about it at the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court rules on that either of the two reasons I just gave you disqualify the referendum. If so, there's no need to hear anything else
Okay.
because, we only have to win on one argument to knock out the referendum. They have to win every single one to preserve it. And again, they were so brazen about how they went about this, and they were so unconcerned about the Constitution, frankly.
Mhm.
It's shocking but not
Unsurprising.
surprising. But and the same was true at the second passage, which happened January 16th and of this year, and had to be done more than 90 days before it was submitted to the voters is the phrasing of the Constitution. Well, it was 90 days before April 21st, but again, we have 45-day elections. Voters started voting on March 6th.
Yeah.
So it was not submitted to those voters 90 days before voting. And if the Democrats don't like their 45-day election, they can get rid of it. But that won't be in time to somehow redo the math from January 16th to March 6th. And Judge Hurley yesterday said this is rather obviously not 90 days as required by the Constitution. And there's a reason for that. We actually saw it play out a bit because the no side started doing really well late. It was a bit of a comeback, if you will.
Yeah.
And if there was more time, and I'm familiar with this,
Money?
I'd have got more
More
money.
money?
Well, not only, the 3-to-1 money, if the money had stayed exactly the same, but all of our money had arrived a month earlier, we'd have run a mail program too. And this race was lost in the mail. We won election day by 9 points. They won early voting by 1.5 points. And they won mail-in voting by 45 points.
Isn't it crazy how that
So
happens? I wanted to ask you about the Supreme Court of Virginia because, as my understanding, and I do, you know way more about it than I do, is that they are to some extent beholden to the General Assembly to keep their jobs, to have their jobs and keep their jobs, which has made some people skeptical about how fair they might be at looking at this referendum. Can you
yeah,
give us some insight on that?
they don't have lifetime tenure like federal judges. They have 12-year terms. The General Assembly elects judges in Virginia, and including the 7 that are on the bench now.
Okay.
Um, Republican General Assemblies elected 4, Democrat General Assemblies elected 3. But we have a less political bench than a lot of other states, like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Montana is the
Mhm.
worst of all. They have very outcome-oriented benches. Um, we have one judge, Thomas Mann, who I think falls in that category. But if he's all by himself, I'm not sure that's terribly harmful. Uh, I think these first 2 challenges that I mentioned to you, particularly the intervening election challenge, that could be a 7-0 ruling. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Um, so we'll
Wow.
see. We'll see.
What?
But the General Assembly does the hiring.
Yeah.
They don't do the firing. They can't do that. But every 12 years, they get another shot at these folks. And but the idea that any Republican would think that this radical left-wing General Assembly is going to reappoint them under any circumstances is fanciful.
Okay. Well, that is a very interesting point because I do think, just looking at it from afar that, wow, they didn't want to consider this before the referendum it was kind of like maybe they're not taking this topic very seriously. But what happens next? So when do you think there might be
Well, briefs are
arguments, there
being
might be
filed
decisions?
today in the Virginia Supreme Court on the first 2 constitutional issues, the voting for a constitutional amendment in a special session called for a budget, and the issue of using the 2025 election as the intervening election. Those are being briefed today, final briefings, I believe, and they are being argued before the court Monday morning at 9 a.m.
Okay, so this
So
is moving.
this is moving very fast as anything I've ever seen them take up. And that's appropriate. I mean, we need to know where the lines are. This needs to be settled
Right.
as soon as possible. And I wouldn't surprise me to see a ruling by mid-May.
Okay. And I mean, if you're putting on your prognostication, what do you think is likely to happen here?
Well, I'll tell you what, if I were a betting man, I'd be betting against the referendum on this.
That's
Their
amazing.
brazenness has been pretty overwhelming, and I think it's going to be their undoing.
Okay, before I let you go, I did want to ask you. I hear from a lot of Virginians about they're in kind of a state of distress right now. There is a should I stay? Should I go? I have lived here a long time, a lot longer than Abigail Spanberger, a lot longer than most people here in Northern Virginia. Granted, I think this interview in itself is pretty refreshing and exciting to know that maybe it's not as doom and gloom as we thought, that this wasn't a done deal, that it's going to be this ridiculous map of 10
Right.
Democrat, 1 Republican seat. So there's been a lot of people like, I'm out of here. I'm moving. I'm moving. And I understand that. I feel that too, especially in Northern Virginia. You're like, who are these people that live next
Well,
door to me? What is wrong
let's
with
talk
them?
about that. So the reason for Virginia's political problems is Washington. And
For sure.
to be clear, that is bipartisan. Both parties, they to quote John McCain, um, they are spending like drunken sailors, but at least drunken sailors are spending their own money.
Hmm.
And when you just endlessly grow the federal government, you endlessly bring in more big government people to run it and companies that make money off of helping it run. And they don't want to live in Maryland. Maryland stinks. So they live in Virginia and they vote big government left. And Northern Virginia has moved steadily. First of all, it's grown fast, as you know, in Loudon. Though that
It's
slowed down,
insane.
that has slowed down, and Donald Trump's holding the line, at least on federal government employment, has played a role in that. But
Yeah.
the budget isn't shrinking, and until we get a balanced budget requirement, Virginia's going to struggle politically. We need to rein in Washington with a balanced budget requirement, and then Virginia can get its politics back.
Texas didn't violate the law when they decided to redistrict. Oklahoma didn't violate the law when they decided to redistrict. Virginia did. And here's what I mean by that. For those of you who don't know, in Virginia, whenever you try to change the Constitution, because, oh, by the way, in 2020, we voted we voted on a ballot referendum, just like the one that just got voted on. We voted on it to say we no longer want politicians drawing the lines. And 65% of Virginians voted to say we want an independent or a quasi-independent commission to draw the line. So that's what we did. And the lines that were given to us were lines that probably slightly favored Democrats, but overall they weren't horrible. They weren't bad, right? And again, it wasn't politicians drawing all the lines. And then you fast forward, and now Democrats are saying, no, now that we're in charge, we want to change it back, and we want to draw the lines, and we want to make Virginia the worst gerrymandered state in the country. Well, if you want to do that, you could, and here's what you would have done. During the normal legislative session, you would have submitted a resolution, a joint resolution, in order to offer a ballot referendum, and then that would have passed the House, it would have passed the Senate, and if it passed both bodies, then what would have happened is you would have had an intervening election. And then after that intervening election, you would have taken the exact same resolution with the exact same language, passed through the House, passed through the Senate. And then it would have gone to a ballot referendum that would have showed up on the ballot in November. That's what would have happened. So is that what happened this time? No, they didn't submit this during regular session. They actually called a special session, or they pulled us back into a special session. And they submitted this legislation, this resolution. Now, you could argue, well, okay, is that still within their purview? It would have been shady, but theoretically, yeah, you could have legally justified that, except for the fact that we had already started voting in that intervening election, which is supposed to take place between the resolution initially passing the legislature and then being resubmitted the following year. Over 1 million Virginians had already voted in the intervening election. I'm sorry, that's illegal. That's a violation. It was Democrats that said, we want to have 45 days of early voting. Republicans didn't say that. They did. And so we pointed out, it's like, okay, but the problem is you're supposed to have an election in between, and that election has already started. And they just said, no, it's election day. The whole reason you have an intervening election is so that citizens can be aware of what their legislature is trying to do with respect to changing the Constitution, and they can let their voices be heard if they don't like it. But if 1 million Virginians have already voted, you arguably have races that have already been decided. And so we pointed out this is a clear violation. They didn't care. We also pointed out that it is right there in Virginia law that the clerks of the court have to have 90 days before the intervening election to tell everybody what is going on. We were already within 90 days of the election when they decided to pass this. Another clear violation of Virginia law. And there was other things that were of concern as well. For instance, did you know that when you actually write the ballot question, you're supposed to use politically neutral language? You're not supposed to stack the deck in favor of one side or the other side. You're simply supposed to explain in very clear English what your legislation would do. But instead, they added this, hey, do you want to vote to restore fairness? And, so let me get this straight. Everybody who voted no voted against restoring fairness? You're not even, it is illegal to use that language. And yet they did it.